Nepal, there's still political turmoil after war and the end of the monarchy.
He says that this protest has to do with a civil war that went on for 10 years, where they were fighting for people's rights, and now they're fighting for people's rights again.
This is a country hungry for change after years of feudal rule. And there's one group of outcasts whose voices are becoming ever louder: Nepal's widows.
She lost her husband, she's now a widow, and her life is very difficult.
For years, widows in Nepal have been despised, persecuted, and abused. To be widowed is to become a pariah. Now they're trying to change that, and they want the world to know about their plight. In Nepal, you don't have to be old to be a widow. You don't even have to be an adult. We're here in search of some of the most vulnerable women in the entire country. This is the Terai, close to the border with India and home to nearly half the country's population. I'd come to meet a child called Geeta. A contact has put us in touch with a girl who got married at the age of 11 and became a widow soon after, and we're on our way to meet her now. I'd been told that it wasn't unusual for parents in the south to marry off their daughters before puberty. I wanted to meet Geeta to find out whether a child could really be a widow. Namaste. Namaste, pleased to... My name is Yemi. Geeta was living with her parents. She said she'd been married when she was 11, but her 18-year-old husband had died a year ago when she was just 13.
खुशी नहीं मिले उतने मैंने ब्याह कर दिल कई वो दोबारा से नहीं बढ़िया लगले कहीं और पूछती है बाबू के पूजी नहीं चले तने.
She says she didn't want to get married at 11. She wanted to study, but her parents couldn't afford it and they forced her to get married. She told me that marriage had been terrifying, but widowhood was worse. She'd been ostracized by her village and made to hide away. At 14, it seemed her life was over. Geeta says that because she's a widow, she's not allowed to go to festivals. She's generally within the confines of the house. She's not allowed to be free like other 14-year-olds. There's little chance she'll remarry. In this part of Nepal, girls can't marry unless their parents pay a dowry to the husband's family. She says her parents are trying to get her remarried, but they paid a dowry for the first marriage and they can't afford another. Geeta said she knew her parents love her, but sometimes they also beat her. It's quite difficult talking about the relationship between Geeta and her parents because her mother is just sitting over there. But I'm surprised she's been that open about the way they've behaved towards her. In fact, Geeta's parents, Govinda and Devkumari, were only too happy to talk. They'd only done what most people here do. Govinda says that it's within their culture for girls to get married early, at the age of 11, because getting married later costs more for the parents. The older the girl is, the more she costs to marry. Geeta was now a social pariah and a crushing burden on her family. Govinda says he can't afford to look after his family because of the dowry that he had to pay for Geeta. Because they can't afford to even buy soap and clothes and food to eat, he gets irritated. And when he gets irritated, that's when he beats Geeta. Geeta told me people in her village shout insults and tell her she's cursed. It seemed treating a child widow with contempt was not unusual. In the nearby town of Lahan, we arranged to meet a human rights campaigner. Sangeeta Pandey was married at 14 and widowed at 18. Now she visits child widows to give them support. She told me that there were many child widows, They face conditions no child should endure. Sangeeta says she's seen child widows in very difficult circumstances. She's seen them sexually abused in family environments. And she says she's seen many go into prostitution because they've got no other way of supporting themselves. At 25, Sangeeta is still a widow. It's rare for widows, especially child widows, to remarry. She says that child widows are regarded as bad luck, and their in-laws blame them for the death of their son. Sangeeta said she could take me to a 15-year-old girl she's trying to help. I was starting to understand that in Nepal, many people shun widows, believing them to bring bad luck to those near them.
Namaste.
Babita explained she was widowed after just a year of marriage, at the age of 14. She still lives with her in-laws. Babita says that in her first year of being a widow, she's only allowed to wear things that identify her as a widow, such as the white sari, silver bangles, translucent beads. But after that first year, she can then wear dull colours, nothing bright. Most people in this region are Hindus and believe in reincarnation. Babita says that people tell her that she's a child widow because she's bad luck, that she did something so terrible in her past life that she's a widow at such a young age, and she's come to believe them. She's only 15, but since Babita was widowed, she does all the cooking and all the cleaning for her husband's family. She also has a 9-month-old son to care for. There's nowhere she can run to. Her father died recently, and now her mother is a widow too. Her father-in-law believes she shaped her own fate. Haridev says that Babita is bad luck because of something she did in her past life. He says that maybe she didn't pray enough. Babita is pinning her hopes on her son. She told me when he's grown up, at least she may be able to live with him. It was becoming clear that Babita didn't want us to talk in front of her in-laws. She told us why. She says her parents-in-law physically and verbally abuse her and blame her for the death of their son. She said it makes her life here unbearable. She preferred us not to ask her in-laws about the abuse, so we couldn't substantiate what she said. I wanted to find out how Babita's family and neighbours had got the idea that child widows are cursed and being punished for sins in past lives. I arranged to meet the most respected Hindu priest in the area. Laxman Jha is hugely influential. Scores of people come to seek his guidance every day. The priest is going through his puja prayer, which he does twice a day, where he prays to 5 gods. Many Hindus would disagree utterly with his interpretation of their religion. But around here, it's his views that matter, and they're not unusual. He says that whatever you did in your past life comes back to your present life. So if you were good in your past life, you will have benefits in your present life. So if you're a child and you're widowed in your present life, it must mean that you did something bad in your past life. And for Laxman Jha, when a woman is widowed is determined by just how sinful she was in her past lives. He says that child widows are worse than adult widows because of something they did in their past lives. And it's because of that that they've lost their husbands at such a young age. He said widows had once practiced the ritual known as sati, They would commit suicide by throwing themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. He says that the system of sati was better than being a child widow. Child widows are a burden. They're of no use to society and they should be kept separate and isolated from the community. My encounter with the priest began to explain why in Nepal child widows are despised outcasts. Now I wanted to find out what life was like for women who are widowed. I travelled to Saket Valley in the west of the country. Some of the worst fighting in the long civil war between Maoist rebels and government forces happened here. The killing stopped in 2006, but its effects are everywhere. I'd arranged to meet one of the many women who were widowed. Mon Kumari still lived with her in-laws. She was nervous. We're just coming into the private room here to talk because I've been advised that if anyone hears what's going on, her situation could become very difficult. It seemed older widows weren't so different to child widows. Mon Kumari didn't want her parents-in-law to hear our conversation. How have the community treated you since you became a widow? It was the same story of insult and discrimination. Mon Kumari said she received no sympathy, even though her husband had been an innocent victim of the war. She says the community discriminates against her because she's a widow. She says they call her bad luck. She says they stop her from going to festivals and weddings. And she says they've told her that her role is to look after her in-laws and to never leave the village. One of her two sons came to see what was happening. Her husband had been killed by an army bullet, but Mon Kumari said her in-laws blamed her for bringing him bad luck. She says after her husband passed away, for many years her parents-in-law treated her badly, and they asked her and her sons to leave on many occasions. Why didn't you take your sons and leave? She said that it was difficult for a widow to live alone. She'd feel insecure because men would sexually harass her and insult her. She had no choice but to live in misery. She says since she became a widow, her life has been extremely difficult and lonely. She says that she's been completely traumatized by the way her parents-in-law treated her, and she doesn't know how she got through the last few years. And she says she's very uncertain about the future. I headed towards the capital, Kathmandu. For centuries, the land below was a royal kingdom. But last year, the monarchy was abolished. I'd heard the new government in Kathmandu was promising change for the poor and downtrodden, including widows. I wanted to find out what that actually meant. In the middle of the capital, something unprecedented was happening.
We've just arrived in the centre of Kathmandu. This is Mandala. It's a restricted area, and widows from all over Nepal have come here to protest.
They weren't protesting against discrimination and persecution, but against a new government policy. A cash incentive of about £400 was being offered to any man willing to marry a widow. For these women, it's proof they're outcasts. They believe the government's treating widows as objects, to be bought and sold by men.
The women are protesting on this side, and their placards are reading things like, the government policy is a dowry. It's basically discrimination against one group of women compared to another, and these widows deserve human rights.
For Nepal and the government, the sight of widows on the streets is a new experience. Widows had come from all over the country. Many had travelled for days. Nimala says that men will be able to use widows in any way they want because of this 50,000 rupee payment. They'll be regarded as dirt. Nimala married at 14 and was widowed at 17. Nimala just said, it's very difficult to live a life as a widow. It's better to die. Tempers began to fray. But then the protesters told us the government had sent word that they'd consider rethinking the policy. The widows hoped the government would give the cash directly to them. The £400 on offer would transform their lives.
Coming here. Durga just told me that the government policy is putting the price on a human being's head, and you can't do that. They're here to persuade the government to go against their policy.
I wanted to find out if they had any chance of success. I set off to meet the politician who's instigated the government cash bonus for men who marry a widow. He's the finance minister in the coalition government that's emerged since the monarchy was abolished a year ago. Surendra Pandey is a left-winger, a leading light in Nepal's United Marxist-Leninist Party.
Why I encourage...
The minister told me he'd taken action because marrying a widow was unthinkable for many Nepalese men. Offering cash to them would enable widows to re-enter society.
But if you're really trying to help widows through this incentive, why not just give the money to the widows themselves?
If you give money, then what will be the incentive to all widows?
He said he wouldn't do that because if he gave money to widows directly, there would be no incentive for them to marry.
So the policy is going to continue?
Yes.
The minister's conviction that the best way to help widows is to pay men to marry them indicates that in Nepal, a woman's worth depends on her marital status. And if you want to see how much Nepalese women fear widowhood, this is where you come.
We've just arrived in a place called Pashupatinath. It's the holiest Hindu temple in the country. Hundreds of thousands of women are here. All these women are here today to celebrate the Tej festival.
Every year for 3 days, women gather to celebrate the reunion of Lord Shiva and the goddess Parvati. They told me this ensures your husband lives a long life, so you're not condemned to the misery of a long widowhood.
Why are you here to worship in the temple?
In Nepal, marriage is everything.
It's important to be married, and it's important to be married for as long as possible. That's why they pray for the long life of their husband.
During Tej, women all over Nepal wear red, the colour you wear on your wedding day.
We can't go beyond this point because we're not Hindus, but this is the ultimate goal for the women in this festival. This is where they pray for their husbands in front of Lord Shiva. They go through this temple, they give their offerings, and they receive their blessings.
Unmarried women also join in the celebrations. They told me it was a chance to pray they'd land a husband soon.
What happens to women who are not married in Nepal?
She told me her boyfriend was working abroad. She was praying she wouldn't remain single long.
She says society treats you differently if you're not married, and if you're not married by 25, you're in difficulties.
Tej shows how important marriage is to a woman's status in Nepal. Those fighting for widows' rights must confront deep-seated beliefs. In Kathmandu, I'd heard some widows are trying to forge independent lives. To find them, I arranged to meet Srijana Kafle, who spent over a decade working with widows. Srijana is trying to help more widows use the courts to claim what's rightfully theirs. She explained that often when a woman is widowed, she not only becomes a social outcast, but loses her home and possessions.
She says that widows are entitled to 100% of their husband's property, but many of them don't realise that they have these rights because of the low level of their education. And many of them are actually deprived of their property rights by their in-laws.
Srijana told me the woman she wanted to introduce us to was living on her own and struggling.
She says that the widow that she's taken us to meet is called Monu, and she's in a miserable situation. She's got 2 young sons that she can't afford to send to school, and she's not having any financial support from her in-laws.
Monu was waiting for us.
Namaste.
She'd moved to Kathmandu with her husband. 6 years ago, he died. Her home's a bedsit, but it's also a challenge to centuries of tradition.
मसँग केही कपडाहरू छ जुन कपडाहरू चाहिँ एउटा जमाका लागि एलाउड छैन लाउन तै पनि मैले चाहिँ लगाउँछु मैले राखेको छु त्यो चाहिँ तपाईलाई देखाउँछु.
And she wanted to show me another way she was challenging Nepalese notions of how widows should behave.
Moni wanted to show me some of her clothes. She's got some brightly coloured clothes that widows wouldn't usually wear.
They were a disguise that hid her widowhood and helped her re-enter society. Yet as she told me her story, I began to realise how tough a journey it had been to get to even this degree of independence.
She moved here because she had to leave her previous place because as soon as they found out that she was a widow, they started treating her differently. If she spoke to men, she was said to be having inappropriate relationships with them. The landlord, when he found out that she was a widow, actually asked her to leave.
She told me that to stop further problems, she'd now constructed an imaginary life.
She says the landlord here treats her well, but that's because they don't know she's a widow. She's told them that she's married, that her husband works abroad, and that she has children who live in a hostel.
On the wall, I spotted some pictures drawn by her two sons. Monu told me she missed her children dreadfully. As we talked more, it became obvious that Monu's attempt to hide her widowhood and lead an independent life was grinding her down.
Monu's just got very upset. She's told me that she's found it really hard financially to look after herself and her children. She refers to her children as her heart.
And in our conversation, she told me something else that was deeply shocking.
She's had to put her two children of 11 and 8 into an orphanage. She's had to pretend that she's dead. And she hates lying like this, she says. But there's no other way of actually ensuring that they're looked after properly. She says that they understand that this has got to happen and that until her financial situation changes, they won't be able to live with her.
Before we left Nepal, I returned to the ancient temple of Pashupatinath. When I'd been here earlier, it'd been packed with women praying for their husbands' well-being. But for many years, this temple and widows had another more chilling association. A family was preparing for a cremation. On that spot, until well into the 20th century, countless widows performed sati, ritual suicide. They would climb onto their husbands' funeral pyres and burn to death. Sati no longer happens, but my journey had convinced me that the attitudes towards widows that fostered it are alive and well, and still largely unchallenged in modern Nepal.